Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's my pleasure and honor to participate in this conference, and I would like to express my thanks to the organizers who invited me. The topic is globalization and human rights. Human rights and globalization might be seen from many different angles, many different scientific angles, including history, including economics, including nationality and ethnic studies, sociology, international relations, and so forth. Here, I would like to concentrate on international law, especially the challenges which are getting more and more meaningful in this field. As an introduction, I would like to call a colleague of mine, Philip Alston. Philip Alston, who participated in a conference about globalization in Washington, D.C., in the lobby saw an inscription which is on the screen, that while everyone was debating the idea of globalization, we were building it. Well, he came to the conclusion that something similar should be made for international lawyers, and his formula is that while non-state actors building the global village, we were busy with yesterday's issues and concepts. So it's a kind of self-criticism of international lawyers, which seems to be very well justified. The question is why? The answer is relatively easy, because international law as such is still conceived as an interstate law. The lawmakers, actually the states. Well, in formal sense, international or intergovernmental organizations also have lawmaking capacity, but in most cases, it doesn't mean more than the member states are wearing a mask. Actually, they are making the law, international law. On the top of all that, the traditional object of international law is the questions of international relations, the diplomatic relations, the law of the sea, and so forth, the territorial acquisition issues, and such things like this. But since 1945, or even before, international law started to regulate more and more areas which were traditionally seen as a domestic issue. Quite a lot of issues which in the past were regulated only by domestic law, now regulated by international law, from human rights to the standardization of cans of beers. So there is a consequence, of course, and the consequence is that if someone is looking at the corpus of international law as it stands today, probably the smaller part deals with interstate relations, and the bigger part is dealing with internal things, a coordination of domestic laws concerning quite a lot of different things. Well, from a theoretical point of view, it might be called transnational law. Well, it's not new at all. Since the 1960s in the literature, the concept of transnational law is used. What is really new is something different, that today's international society, non-state actors are getting more and more role. And that's what was referred by Philip Alston, that international law is in trouble because we are in deep trouble if we would like to accommodate the relationship between states on one side and non-state actors on the other side. It's really a major challenge today's international law. I could give you some example to illustrate what I mean. Well, the first example is the self-defense. Well, it's quite obvious if someone is attacked, he has a right to defend himself or herself. But it's not so obvious in this context in international law, because the UN rules, the UN Charter rules, were formed quite a long time ago, and a classic interstate conflict was the base which was in the mind of the lawmakers. So, although it's a little bit incredible, if we are strictly speaking from international point of view, it's rather difficult, it's very difficult to justify on the base of the rules of the UN Charter a natural right of self-defense against a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda. Well, there are other challenges interconnected with terrorism and terrorists. What to do with terrorists from the point of view of humanitarian law? Is a terrorist a warrior in the sense of humanitarian law or not? Has he have a possibility to get the prisoners of war status or not? Well, the war on terror, which was really a massive challenge in the previous decade, they were really important, probably the most important international legal question standing behind. But beside the above-mentioned examples, we could enlist quite a lot of other things. De facto states. How far a de facto state is responsible for the protection of human rights? Is it a state or not? Well, what is the consequence? What about failed states, where the government doesn't have an overall control over the territory? Is it still justified to demand that the government should guarantee the rights of the individuals? What to do with transnational companies who are acting in many countries? How far they can be responsible? And what might be the procedural part of it? What to do with the rebels, those organizations which are claiming that they are fighting for independence? And generally, what to do with internet? If there is a defamation on internet against someone, what is the legal possibility to fight back? Because of the very transnational nature of the web. Of course, crime syndicates are also transnational actors, and sometimes they are severely violates human rights. Well, in the literature, it is quite a commonplace to say that states are the greatest violators and the guarantors of human rights at the same time. And American author Jack Donnelly came forward with the idea that thanks to globalization, the situation is different. So there is a change in the traditional paradox. He came to the conclusion that states are more protectors than violators, thanks to the violations made by non-state actors. The question, is it really true or not? In my understanding, it can be debated. Why? It can be debated because, as it happens in many times, states and non-state actors, transnational companies or rebel forces or any other non-state actors are acting together or frequently colluding in denying human rights. On the other hand, if you're looking at it from another point of view, the transnationally organized human rights NGOs are also non-state actors, and obvious that they are not violators, but the defenders, protectors of human rights. Well, probably the most important question from the point of view of international law, what kind of answers should be given to the challenges posed by the non-state actors? And here I listed some possible solutions. One possibility which is actually taking place, so it's not a theory, it's a practice, the reinterpretation of existing international legal norms, which means that the international bodies which are dealing with the supervision over the implementation of human rights these days are also dealing with the so-called de facto states like Northern Cyprus or Transnistria. So they are visited, they are under the obligation to send a report and cooperate with the UN or the Council of Europe in this field. Well, the traditional answer, which is quite understandable from the traditions of international law, that there should be, it's quite necessary to find a state who is responsible or who is responsible on behalf of the non-state actor. And sometimes that's not very easy, because if we are talking about a rebel organization or liberation movement or I don't know what, the responsibility of the territorial state, you should know that the International Court of Justice in its ruling came to the conclusion that there is a precondition. The precondition is the effective overall control over the territory, and it's not really the case in many practical situations. As far as the TNCs are concerned, the problem is different. It could happen that in a third world state, in a developing state, the legal system is not sophisticated. The civil human rights NGOs are not developed enough. There is a corruption in the justice system and things like this. So it's really a problem. And a solution might be the forum shopping, to start a litigation in the mother country of the transnational company, if it is possible, according to according to the law of that country. Well, of course, it would be rather nice to impose direct responsibility in international treaties on non-state actors. But that's really not the case. In most situations, what we could find are codes, soft law instruments, for example, for transnational companies. Of course, sometimes there are exceptions, because we know about decisions of the Security Council, which are legally binding and having a priority in the international legal system, when certain measures ordered directly against a terrorist group. Well, of course, there is a role for voluntary regulation. So you know about that transnational companies, for example, create their own ethical codes. For example, the Rainforest Alliance, which can be seen on many products these days, on banana, for example, or fair trade. The real question is what is standing behind, how far the self-imposed rules are met. And of course, there is a further possibility, and unfortunately, especially in the case of TNCs, it frequently happens that the implementation is simply left for civil society, for human rights organizations, to litigate, to start a trial case and organize a boycott of certain products, as you could see on the picture in the case of Nike shoes. Well, here I would like to turn to another possible interpretation of human rights globalization. And it is rather debated in the literature how far we could identify globalization on one hand and universalism, universal protection of human rights on the other hand. I would like to go details here. It's a possible, I think it's a justified approach. Well, the bookshelves are full of books about the debate of universalism and cultural relativism. Here I would like to concentrate on the answer of international law. Well, you could come to the conclusion that it's a formal answer. But if you look at the number of ratifying states of big universal treaties like UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you could easily come to the conclusion that there is no problem because we have 190-something states in the world and the 165 ratified for the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So where are the cultural differences? But if you look into the ratification document, you could identify quite a lot of reservations, which means that with the help of the reservations, those states could live together with the universal standards of human rights. As Carl Schmitt stated some decades ago, an international treaty is based on two things. One thing is consensus, the other is reservation. Well, there is another possible interpretation of human rights globalization. It is justified to speak about the global community of human rights law. It's really an interesting thing. As I try to emphasize, it's not based on a formal legal obligation. It's based on the intellectual power. It's based on the charming power of interpretation which is provided by this or that international body. So in the literature, it's frequently quoted that the South African Constitutional Court, when declared that death penalty is unconstitutional, quoted the European Court of Human Rights. What to do South Africa with Europe and European Human Rights Court? And that's generally the case. The European Court of Human Rights, in a sociological, of course not in a legal sense, became a world court on human rights because its decisions are quoted and used, so not simply quoted, but used almost everywhere. Used in the American court, on a Latin American continent, or the UN Human Rights Committee is also using it. So consequently, there is, we could come to the conclusion that there is such a community standing behind. Finally, I would like to tell you some words about the problems of asylum seekers as a major international issue these days. First, I would like to start with a remark, which is sometimes provocative, but I think it's true, that the asylum seekers go to the US or go to Canada or go to Australia. That's really a major international challenge. If the same persons go to the neighboring developing country, it's business as usual. Who cares? Who cares about those who are simply moving to the neighboring states? That's simply a part of our life. Well, maybe the UNHCR, of course, because pursuing his mandate, of course, know about it and deal with it. There is a further remark concerning the human rights position, of asylum seekers. In 1945, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Actually, in the Article 14 of the Declaration, there was a right to asylum enshrined. It's interesting if you look at para 1, because it says everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy asylum, not to get. That's really a difference. And later on, in 1966, let me add that in 1948, no one ever dreamed that the Universal Declaration will be legally binding, because it was a legally not binding instrument. That was a resolution of the UN General Assembly. And when later on, in some almost 20 years later, when the states were ready to conclude legally binding instruments, in this field, the relevant instrument is the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And you look through the text, you will find nothing about right to asylum. Nothing. Of course, you could argue that we have UNHCR, and also you could argue that we have the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Rights of Asylum Seekers, but that's something different. That means that the international community opted for a heavily different approach, using a kind of filter system. So that's the essence of the 1951 Geneva Convention. So when we are reading the text of international law, they are frequently revealing the real intentions of states. Thank you very much for your attention.
Right, thank you, Gábor. And our last speaker, who has happily arrived, is Erzsébet. Please go.
Ladies and gentlemen, professor and colleagues, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to this very important conference. I see the feasibility of the real, effective protection of children as one of the greatest questions among the challenges of globalization. Considering this, I would have in fact loved to start my talk with the title of the presentation of Richard Jolley, Be Outraged. The acceptance of the Convention on the Right of the Child, 1989, and other legal documents has truly been a grand accomplishment in the history of the civilized nations. We have accepted United Nations Declaration on the Protection and Welfare of Children, General Assembly resolution by the name is Beijing Rules concerning the situation of children in the administration of justice, the Malmö Declaration on the protection of children without their parents, the European Social Charter mentioned the special right. We signed World Declaration on the survival, protection and development of children. And international courts, such as the ECTHR, are continuously dealing with their protection. At the same time, we have to admit that a good portion of the children's rights, and indeed goals, are not obvious requirements, only alternatives, at the most even in democratic states. They are handled as secondary by legislation, and their application in everyday practice is often met by incomprehension, surprise, considering smiles, and the lack of knowledge of enforcers. To be more exact, as long as they appear on the level of words, everyone is busy nodding, but their factual application, well, that somehow doesn't want to happen. The fate of a child is still primarily determined by where they are born, to who their parents are, why the decision makers on a global scale don't regard their protection and welfare as priority. Yes, we all know success stories, but those are unique. The fact that everything happening during childhood affects adult life and thinking isn't present in everyday thought. It isn't ingrained in everyday life that the welfare, health, and education of the child must, under all circumstances, enjoy priority for the sake of a sustainable future. There are no universal actions programs which would be given priority under all circumstances, ensuring that every child receives an opportunity to develop and make manifest their talents and skills, regardless of origin or country. Instead, it's always the case that the children with the weakest possibility of interest enforcement within the fabric of society have to fight for their survival. Don't tell me otherwise. Just take this past summer when Europe faced the issue of migration, when it had been failing this exam already. Politicians argued in silence or loudly of this and that, and all along not a word was spoken on the question of what would happen to the pursued children wandering without or fleeing with their parents. Putting it lightly, I regard as it political cynicism that these children were left to the mercy of Darwinism. Yes, there will be survivors. I myself have got to know an Afghan Hazara boy this summer who has been granted Hungarian citizenship after 10 years in this September. He had started fleeing with his sick sibling and surviving mother when he was 7 years old. Having survived Iranian refugee camps, having left his mother and 6 siblings behind, he set off alone when he was 9, and after 2 years of traveling and hiding, he arrived in Hungary. Only just waking from a dream, he believed the outskirts of Budapest to be the old Kabul, so he got off the train. After a few police attacks, he ended up an institution. Since then, he has received his high school diploma, and he believes he has found a new home. By now, he can speak 4 languages: Dari, Hungarian, English, and Eastern Persian. Currently, he is as far as possible from realizing his dream of becoming an internationally renowned tour guide or internationally interpreter. The story of Darius, his name is Darius, can be found on YouTube. And Darius isn't asking for help because he doesn't want to special individual treatment. He wants to give a chance to himself and to the outskirts of the world who are first and foremost children. This comes first, even before his dream. In my opinion, there are refugees, there are persecuted people, and there are children who fall into both categories. Because they are weak and powerless, and because societies differentiate between the institution of adults and children only in words. Democracies of Europe have no answer to the issue of refugee children's status, but neither do Americans, because they have no appropriate solutions for the status of their own nation's children either. And why? The approach the states take is wrong. They want to offer some support and not to make an investment in their future. And concerning the future, there is only one sensible main goal: the elimination of poverty, of inequality between generations, and of the inequality among states. I think that all of this can have one starting point: the protection of children, of the youth, of the future, because their future, our future, will be our future. And for this end, adult society has to give up part of its own welfare. If adult society is unable to take equal responsibility for all children, for children of Brazilian favelas, of Bronx districts, of housing estates of North London, of villages in Hungarian Nyírség, and for Syrian, Ethiopian, Nigerian refugee children, then it is a washout failure. It has lost its own future. Namely, children experience the future of the world surrounding them through us, and like it or not, their system of values will adapt to this. In terms of the future, children have privileged rights over us adults. Not everyone gets even this far in their through process, or if they do so only in words, not in action. The problem is that nation states don't have a lasting, enduring strategy to state the ways how these privileged rights can be secured, or even to identify what these rights are. The latest survey on behalf of the Commission bears witness to the fact that the states don't communicate with the population concerned, not even about such basic questions as who regards what to be a right, an opportunity, or an action plan. The most important moral to be drawn is that the children have precisely identified the barriers to communication. First, the lack of respect from the adult world, the pressure on them to be successful, the lack of parental support, external restrictions and influences, openly applied pressure, dependence, and violence by the media, by their peers, from environment, by teachers, or by parents. Therefore, they have no illusions about rights, let alone their own rights, and they don't trust that those can be enforced. But if there is a consensus in any question among children, then it is in one thing: securing equal opportunities. I have to add, however, that for this the responsibility falls exclusively upon adult society. It's not a coincidence that children have drafted assistance and support as the most important right. This includes the right to life, the right to food, the right for a place to live, the right to be listened to, the right to avoid discrimination, the right to grow up free of violence, including psychical terror, the right to the protection from abuse, the right to be cared for. Only after all these do the rights valued so greatly by adult society appear: education, sports, nurturing talent, and so on. This shows that adult society has an illusion about children's rights, which has nothing to do with reality. The children put it his way: people released from life are sitting in their sets and determine what should happen with us as they work on a deadline, following rules and expectations not to know us. It's very hard critic. While speaking of human rights in the framework of sustainable development, this is the source printable critic. This is to say, we shouldn't be proud of ourselves, and much less should we be content. We haven't achieved a lot concerning children's rights. There may be reports of victory, but we have taken virtually no steps on the road. In my opinion, we would be waiting in vain for adult society to adapt rational expectations of its own volition. This has to be forced. And the main problem is that adult society would have to be taught to defend its own rights and to reach the required degree of solidarity through which it could see to children's rights. For these organized legal frameworks are needed. However, in the very moment we start discussing the constructions of this basis of enforcement of children's rights, or even the protection of children's rights, the struggle for material goods and concerns from comfort come up stronger in the class of interests. States spend on these rights only if they are forced to do so. Moreover, sometimes they would rather pay for the violation of rights, see the activities of the ECTHR, instead of investing in prevention. Taking into consideration that organized frameworks cannot be operated without financial foundations, that states have to be forced to produce these foundations in advance. Surely, there are several ways to achieve this end, but for example, for the sake of continuous sustainability, it has to be prescribed that they should separate a certain percent of their annual GDP and transfer it to an internationally overseen account created specifically for this goal. They should separate and transfer to the same account a sort of tax, a certain percentage of every state investment, and every investment financed from public funds, with the exceptions of investment for child welfare and healthcare. They should transfer for the same account a certain part of state-approved gambling incomes. They should transfer to the same account a certain percentage of administration charges, fees, punishments that serve as a source of income for the state. And it should also be prescribed that only international organizations should be allowed to manage and use the fund thus created. The system of institutions which will provide a framework for the establishment of the new system of the protection of rights also has to be set up using this fund. All of this is only neither a vision, if you like. Still, this conference serves exactly the goal of moving forward from the status quo, which is only possible through visions. Thank you for your attention.